Hello, all you lovely humans, and welcome to a very special episode of Audio Video Delight. I have returned from the dead, and today we're going to talk about something that's kind of related to Death in a way because of how dark it is, and that is Watchmen. In this video, we will go over the messages in both the original series and in the TV show on HBO and discuss how relevant these messages are today and just how amazing the Watchmen universe is in general. Let's begin, shall we? From this point on, there will be major spoilers for both the Watchmen graphic novel and the HBO series. So if you have not read or seen either of those, I would strongly recommend doing so before viewing this video. But I can't control you, so do whatever you want. The first thing I would like to talk about is what the original comic book series covers both thematically and plot wise. This series subverted expectations for a comic book property and kind of pokes fun at a lot of superhero comics. But it also manages to be extremely dark and insightful. The series is set in the 80s and it also came out during the 80s. However, the series is set in an alternate timeline. What this means is there are some minor and major differences, such as Nixon being president for longer and the US winning the Vietnam War. Now, a big element in the series is superheroes. But Watchmen does not portray superheroes in the way that most comic media does, as heroic or valiant. What the series does is shows the darker side of heroes and how it's not all glory and how things can get serious and nasty real fast. It also shows that people have dark sides to them and they have weaknesses. And a lot of comic books portray heroes as having no weaknesses, but what's cool about Watchmen is it kind of shows how superheroes are just people, and it's just really interesting how it shows you different situations where like many people could relate to them even though they are technically superheroes. A big motif of the original series is time, which also becomes a motif later in the HBO series, but we'll get to that in a bit. But the comic book series uses time in a way to show impending doom. It even uses the doomsday clock in many representations of time throughout the book to just show that the story keeps moving on and getting closer to peril. The ending of this book is very intense. Although this book can get gory, it's it's never as gory as the ending. In the end of this book, a giant tentacle creature is released by Vite or Ozymandias, and he ends up killing thousands of people. However, in his mind, he's doing the world a service because it stops war. But this is still a massive tragedy, and it clearly shows Ozymandias' greed, and it kind of just shows how he's just trying to fulfill his own prophecy by doing this. Ozymandias makes a very interesting reappearance in the HBO series, and I think it's one of the best parts of the show. Although many of the heroes that are focused on in this comic book series are pretty much human, there is one character who is almost completely the opposite of that, and that is Dr. Manhattan. The book shows what it's like when you start to lose your humanity in a very interesting way. Dr. Manhattan is incredibly powerful. He can fly, teleport, change his size, use telekinesis, pretty much whatever he wants to do. However, when he transforms into Dr. Manhattan by spending too long in an intrinsic field chamber, which alters his DNA completely, he becomes Dr. Manhattan, which is this blue figure and is usually seen naked. I don't know why. That's just how he is. That's just how he chooses to live his life. But he's like I said, he is extremely powerful, but the one thing that is his weakness is he loses his humanity in his transformation. And this is a very interesting topic. He he ceases to be able to connect with his fellow humans, and as a result of this, he feels distance, and he decides to just leave and go to Mars and create his own civilization, which is a very interesting way to solve that problem. However, he still feels somewhat of a connection to humans as he comes back in the HBO series. An interesting thing about Watchmen is there's not really a clear-cut villain in the story. Ozymandias could be considered a villain because of his actions, which resulted in a lot of tragedy. However, what he did could also be perceived as heroic in a way because he ended up saving humanity from war. There are several heroes throughout the story that kind of have a moral gray area and could be considered either heroic or more of a villain throughout the whole book. So it kind of leaves the reader to decide who the villain of the story is. And it just shows that you don't need to have a vanilla story formula where you have clearly defined heroes and clearly defined villains, or protagonists and antagonists. And a lot of the characters in the story lie somewhere in the middle. The main tone throughout the Watchmen comic book series is very dark. It opens up with a hero dying, and his blood is splattered on his signature pin, which has a smiley face, which is actually seen on the cover of the book right here. And this is a very interesting way to start, because right away you have a hero dying, which is normally like a terrible thing to do in a Marvel or DC movie, to kill off one of the main heroes right away. However, we find out later that he actually has a very dark side to him, and he raped some of the characters. He killed like tens, 20s, who knows how many he's killed. And he was just a horrible person overall. This overall darkness continues throughout the book. And even at the end, there's not really a happy ending. As I discussed previously, at the end, many people die, and there's not really a clear resolution. Although things get wrapped up, they don't necessarily get wrapped up in a happy way. And I think it's good for something like this to have an unhappy ending, because the whole purpose of Watchmen is to subvert your expectations, and it does that brilliantly. This is why I think someone who's a fan of superhero movies or comic books should take a look at Watchmen if they haven't read it, or the series as well, because when I say series, I mean HBO series, because it subverts your expectations for what a superhero related media can be. And even people who do not normally enjoy superhero media would enjoy this book because it does something that pretty much nothing else does. And that is to just create a very dark story with many layers and characters that aren't perfect. and that's why I love the book so much. When I heard they were going to make an HBO series based on Watchmen, I was incredibly excited because this is such an interesting way to represent superheroes, and there's just so many more places they could take the idea. And it made me even more excited when I found out that it wasn't going to be like a complete copy of the book. It's an adaptation, so it allows the series to do really whatever it wants while still keeping some of the characters intact, which is, I think, brilliant. The HBO series focuses a lot on racial discrimination, and I think it is very relevant for the current times. It is a very good way to show how terribly African Americans have been treated throughout history, and even the show opens up with the Tulsa massacre, which is usually ignored when people are taught history nowadays. The Tulsa massacre occurred in 1921, and basically thousands of African Americans were brutally murdered by people in the KKK and white supremacists in an effort to tear down African Americans' prosperity. And for this show to open on something so horrific is a great way to remind viewers that Watchmen is a dark IP, and they are not afraid to go places that make people uncomfortable. This show has a brilliant soundtrack done by Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross, and I think it sets the tone wonderfully. It gives the show a very foreboding and dark atmosphere, and the synthesizers that are used are very gritty sounding. And I would say the show itself is also a very gritty show, so it fits well. And throughout the show, there are many motifs that are used to represent different characters throughout the music, and I think it's a great way just to remind viewers that a certain character is on screen. The motif of time returns in the HBO series right away from the first episode. There are many clocks seen throughout the show, and there's even ticking incorporated into the soundtrack itself. Again, I think that the motif of a clock is just to show that things just keep moving on, and it's kind of to show an impending doom, like building up to something. And I think that the series tackles that idea wonderfully. It creates a lot of suspense for the viewer, and once again, it kind of subverts expectations and makes viewers uncomfortable. A new motif in the Watchmen HBO series is the motif of life, or as the show chooses to represent it most often, is with an egg. An egg is the most simple way to show what life is. It's a very tangible object, and it also can be both alive and dead at the same time. A chicken might either give an egg life, or it could just be not fertilized. And throughout the show, there are many examples of life being given and taken away. For example, Dr. Manhattan chooses to inhabit the moon of Neptune with life. However, when Ozymandias is sent there, he brutally murders all of the life that has been created. And it just shows you how fragile life is and how it could be taken away at any moment. Like I said, this show is dark. Speaking of Dr. Manhattan, he is one of the characters that is reintroduced in the HBO series, and I think it is very interesting how in the HBO series, it shows how he kind of reconnects with his humanity a little bit and ends up falling in love with Angela Abar. And he kind of remembers what it's like to be human, and he even goes so far as to remove his memory of being Dr. Manhattan. So he's basically human again until the last episode. But it's really cool to see how far he went to regain his humanity, because he yearned for that so much once he transformed into Dr. Manhattan, because he basically lost his soul. And I think the way that they show how Dr. Manhattan attempts to regain humanity and is even successful in some way is really cool. And it's always interesting to explore ideas with life forms other than humans that almost kind of act like humans, such as Spock from Star Trek, or like any like cyborg character that's seen in sci-fi media. It's just cool to see how writers struggle to write for something that isn't entirely human. The thing I really liked about the HBO series is it was able to stand on its own while still referring to many topics from the original comic book series and even expanding on some of the ideas. It brings back the idea of greed and corruption, as well as the idea of people not being completely perfect. Angela cares for her family, but she is not a perfect person at all. She's incredibly violent, as well as her grandfather, who turns out to be Hooded Justice, which I think is brilliant because he was the only character in the original series who we never really found out his identity, and I think it's a very cool way to explore who the Hooded Justice actually was, and the way they handle that is just brilliant. They even the way they show his backstory is very unique, with Angela literally consuming her grandfather's memories. Just the way that is represented is interesting, because she loses herself in his memories and she's actually experiencing it. And that's a good way of showing how our ancestors' pain never really leaves us through the stories they tell and like their memories. The pain is still there, and it's still a struggle. If your family members experienced pain in the past, it's still a part of the family and probably will be there for generations. And it's really cool to see how Angela is much like her grandfather. She still has that hate, and they're really not that much different. And I think at one of the most powerful things in the show, in the last episode, it was very cool to see how I believe it was Angela's grandfather said, "It's not just hate when I put on the mask. It's also fear." And honestly, that's like a very big driving thing in a lot of minorities today, is fear, because they have been discriminated against, and a lot of minorities have to struggle every day just to get by. And I think that Watchmen represents discrimination in a very powerful way, and the last episode was incredibly impactful, just wrapping all of that up. And overall, I would say that although I like both the original series and the HBO series for different reasons, I think that they're they're both amazing in their own regard, and I think although it's not necessary to watch this HBO series and read the book, as it kind of the HBO series kind of goes into a little bit of the backstory, it's a better experience because, like I said, they kind of expand upon the ideas mentioned in the original book, and they also make a lot of references to the original series while still kind of doing their own thing with it. And I think that the HBO series is really well done. I think that everyone should check it out. If you didn't listen to my advice at the beginning and just watch the series and read the book beforehand, please do so now, even though I basically spoiled a lot of it. And thank you all for watching. And look for a new video coming some Friday in the future. I don't know when it will be, but it'll most likely be a Friday. Uh, and I hope everyone stays safe and just has a good summer despite all the craziness. And goodbye, all you lovely humans.